I was going to write a video about the 2022 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and all of the crazy stuff that happened, and then I watched that race. So I decided, you know what? Why not? Let's write an entire video about one of the most controversial, most exciting races in our immediate history, Abu Dhabi 21. And then I went back and I watched that race, and it was even worse. Now, realistically, Abu Dhabi 22 may not have been that exciting because, well, the Drivers' Championship was already sealed weeks ago in Japan. But not only was Abu Dhabi 22 an improvement over last year, I've still got quite a few questions about the race that I want to talk to you about. For example, why didn't Verstappen help Perez beat Leclerc so that Perez could finish P2 in the Drivers' Championship? Or the better question yet, which is more important for the entire field, which strategy was better, the two-stop or the one-stop? So as usual, let's get some data out and break down the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and fuck it, you know what, we'll look at 21 as well. Now, before we get into the video, probably one of the biggest questions that we've had this season is, did the 2022 regulations actually improve the racing? And there are a lot of feelings out there about this topic. And the general consensus is, yes, I think the regulations did improve racing and the ability for cars to follow more closely. Now, there are some other feelings out there which basically say if your driver had a bad season, the regulations are a failure, but realistically, both of those things are feelings, and we need data to answer this question objectively. And that requires the analysis of a lot of data, coming up with some meaningful metrics and comparing, what is good racing? What does that look like? So if you're not subscribed to the channel already, what are you waiting for? I'll be working on that video in the off season as it does require quite a bit of analysis and heavy lifting. But since we're on Abu Dhabi, let's talk about this race in isolation. This year, the spread of the field was the same as last year. So the front of the field to the back of the field, if you exclude the Tifi. Now, this year, there were 79 overtakes compared to last year's 36 overtakes. More than double. I think those are two very good signs. But for the whole season, the championship leaders were still quite far away from the midfield. And honestly, that's not so surprising when you come to a new set of regulations. Some teams are going to get it right, and some teams are going to get it wrong. But this should converge over the next couple of years. Now, before I even started writing the analysis for 2022, I was like, man, that race wasn't very exciting. So let's go back and look at what an amazing race the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix was. There was so much controversy, there was so much great racing. I went back and looked at this. Abu Dhabi 21 was a pretty shit race. And there's only one reason people are still talking about that race. I mean, it did help that the controversy outrage was over the Drivers' Championship, P1, but if that controversy had been centered around P2, I don't think anybody would care. This was a boring race until Latifi crashed, and maybe there was a little bit of excitement that Perez held up Lewis for over 5 seconds, but that was pretty much it. So we do not have to talk about that race ever again. Let's move on to 22. Now, honestly, Abu Dhabi 22 was not that bad. It was a far better race than 21, albeit with a lot less drama, and there wasn't really so much to get invested in at first glance. I mean, the only really big things in my mind were we had Sebastian Vettel's last race, and Perez and Leclerc needed to square up for who was taking home P2 and the Drivers' Championship. Let's be honest, for the same reason that people think 2022 was a crap season because Max ran away with the Drivers' Championship in such a dominant way, and there were only a handful of drivers on the podium, it felt like nobody was actually paying attention to the midfield action. And for that same reason, people really only seem to focus on the front. So, I really don't feel like anybody was that invested in the P2 Drivers' Championship between Leclerc and Perez. And to be fair, in extension to that, nobody actually even cares who wins the Constructors' Championship, honestly, other than the teams. But I'm getting sidetracked. Anyways, now we had a very interesting situation play out in this race. A lot of people wondered, why didn't Max help Checo in the fight for P2? Or should they have been on a one-stop or a two-stop strategy? Which one was faster? All of these questions are actually related, so let's dig into it. Most of the teams split their strategies across cars between the one-stop and the two-stop, which we haven't seen that many times in the last few races. So which strategy was better? As usual, that completely depends. In order to make the one-stop work around Abu Dhabi, the drivers are likely going to have to use quite a bit of tire management to manage the degradation of those tires. Now, in order to make the two-stop work, the driver will have to go substantially faster than the one-stop because they need to make up for that extra time that they've lost doing the additional pit stop. So, looking back at the data through the whole race, both of these strategies were completely viable. But when you've got 19 other cars on the track, sometimes it becomes a little bit more difficult to predict it. So let's look into it. I'm not going to spend too much time on the first few of these. Feel free to pause the video if you want to study them. Or if you want access to all these charts and analysis and a lot more of my insight into what's going on, be sure to check out the Buy Me a Coffee members section. I'll leave a link in the description below. So here are the McLaren teammates. We've got Lando and Daniel. Now this is our race trace or cumulative delta plots. Realistically, you don't need to worry about what the zero line means. All you need to focus on is the gaps between drivers. And this represents on any lap the distance between two drivers as they cross the start-finish line. So you can see here, Daniel is on the one-stop strategy and Lando is on a two-stop. Looking at this realistically, I don't think Daniel's pace was particularly strong. He struggled to hold on to the back of this group. He gets into a bit of degradation. He pits here, comes out further back, and then just ends up falling away through the race. Realistically, for Daniel's situation, the one stop was not ideal. He spends quite a bit of his race up behind other cars. Now, if you look at Lando's two stop, yes, he does get overtaken by the Mercedes. He spends the rest of the first stint in clean air, drops. He has to come through a couple of cars here. He spends all of the second stint for the most part in clean air, pits again, and then clean air on the final stint before getting into a little bit of degradation and being caught up by Ocon. So in this instance, I think Lando's pace was better and that made the two-stop look good. If you want to look at this more, feel free to pause the video, or if you want even more details, check out the link I mentioned in the description. Now, here's the Aston Martin race, and it's a little bit different than the McLaren race. Seb starts further up the grid on a one-stop and ends up losing out to Lance on a two-stop, but I don't think that means that the two-stop was necessarily better. Let's look at it. Now, the biggest thing here that hurt Seb's race is how much time they spent on this tire. Look at how much degradation, look at how much track time he's losing out to everyone else by staying out and going so long on this tire. To me, this looks like a strategic mistake. Maybe they didn't think they could go longer on the hards, so they waited until about lap 26 or so to pit, whereas most of the other one-stoppers and Ricciardo stopped around lap 20. I mean, let's look at this. At this point, you can see Daniel here. Seb is about just over 5 seconds up the road. After Seb pits, he's more than 5 seconds behind Daniel, so that tells me this was a bit of a mistake on the strategy point of view. And then looking at Lance's two-stop race, he managed this race fairly well. With complete hindsight, looking at this, if they had pit Seb sooner and Seb could have made that second stint last even longer, in their case, I think the one stop would have probably been better for Seb. I mean, look at it. So if we assume that to his ideal race, Seb's lost maybe 12 seconds, he's about 10 seconds behind Lance at this point. I think pitting earlier, if they could have made the hard last, I think was definitely a better play for Aston there, but that's racing. Now, Mercedes is another very interesting comparison across their drivers. Hamilton went for the one stop and Russell went for the two. Now, it's not clear if Russell was always on the two stop or if he converted to a two stop once he got the 5-second penalty from the unsafe release in the first stop. Now, let's focus on Lewis's race first. Lewis tangles here with Sainz, ends up going over the curb, losing a bit of track time. Russell comes through. Now, Hamilton goes a little bit longer than Russell and pits, and then commits to the one stop from here. He goes all the way until about lap 55 and then retires with hydraulics issues. It might have been related to hitting the curb at the beginning of the race. If we compare that to Russell's race, I think the two-stop strategy was actually slightly faster for Mercedes. Now, focusing on Russell, in the second stint, he really didn't have the pace to close up the gap to Carlos here. And on the final stint, if it were not for the 5-second time penalty, I think Russell probably would have been challenging Lewis here. So at the end of the race, Russell drops his pace quite massively. So here's the lap times. These are fuel corrected times, so they won't match up with the timing screen. But you can see he's sitting here doing 88-second laps and then drops over 3 seconds a lap time. It looks like they were probably just covering the situation in case George had any issues that were the same as Lewis had. They take some pace out of the car, slow the car down, and try and conserve it and get that car home to the end. Now, in the case of Mercedes, I think the one stop and the two stop were actually pretty closely matched in a perfect race. Unfortunately, neither George nor Lewis had the perfect race. That being said, I think for Mercedes and this track and that car, I think realistically P5 and P6 was the best they could have achieved. Now it's time to talk about what we've all been waiting for, the fight for P2 in the Drivers' Championship. I'm sorry, I'm just struggling to get too excited about this, but anyway, let's talk about it. It's actually pretty interesting. Now, Sainz doesn't really feature in this race at all, so we're going to completely ignore his two-stop. Spoiler alert, he was on a pretty slow two-stop, and he really didn't have the pace of Leclerc this weekend, but managed to finish P4 just behind Perez. So let's break down the front of the race. Verstappen and Leclerc go for the one-stop strategy and Perez goes for the two-stop. All three drivers start on a medium, but if you look at the front of the race, the front 3 or 4 drivers spread out pretty quickly if you compare that to the midfield. Now, Verstappen runs away with the lead and he makes quite a big gap over the rest. So Perez struggles to hold onto Max's wheel. You can see the gap opening between the two. And honestly, this is what destroys Perez's chance for the two-stop strategy and P2 in the Drivers' Championship, but we'll come back to that in just a second. Now, during the first stint, Leclerc looks to be falling away initially and then comes back a little bit, and he stretches out this first stint longer than Perez manages. In general, I think the Ferrari just didn't have the pace to challenge Verstappen this weekend, and Max, in the second stint here, he manages his gap to Leclerc the entire time. So let's go back to Perez. At his first stop, Perez comes out just behind Vettel here. And then after Max pits, Perez comes out behind him. Looking at this, I'm pretty sure this was not the plan at all. First of all, I don't think Perez was expected to get this much degradation. I don't think he was expected to come out behind Vettel. And realistically, looking at all of those things, Perez should have come out ahead of Verstappen here, but his pace in the first stint really hurt that chance. Let's say that Perez did manage to keep up his pace a bit longer, not hit the degradation and come out ahead of Max. Perez would have pit here. He would have come out ahead of Verstappen, carried on with the faster two-stop race. He would have had to box again and potentially would have been challenging Max for the race win. But it just didn't look like he had the pace this weekend. Now, if you remember watching the race, at this point, Perez says he's being held up by Max and he really struggles to get closer within 2 seconds. But if you look at the lap times, as soon as Verstappen comes out ahead of him, the pace does drop off massively for Perez. Now, why don't they swap the two drivers at this point and let Perez ahead? Honestly, I don't know. Arguably, Perez on the two-stop could push a lot harder than Verstappen and maybe pull a gap to him and not compromise his race if they did let him through. But with full hindsight, even if Perez had been let past and had to pit again, I'm not sure his pace was good enough to beat Verstappen, but possibly he could have beaten Leclerc. So this is pretty interesting and I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think we'll figure it out. Perez's second stop seems very early. That's a very short stint for a hard tire. But looking at it, this is actually just to get him back into clean air. Arguably, with full hindsight, I think the team did expect Perez to be in clean air here, but he wasn't. So they pit him again, and he has the job of chasing down Leclerc, and honestly, it's pretty close. Now, Perez finishes third just a couple of seconds behind Leclerc. He had to come through Hamilton here, which cost him a little bit of time, but that's racing. At the end, Verstappen goes on to win the race. He finishes with 15 wins in a season. And honestly, I'm not sure what happened last week in Brazil, but again, here, there were no compromises for Verstappen's race. I think they've made that kind of clear. Even if Perez had finished ahead of Verstappen in Brazil, Leclerc would have still been 1 point ahead in the Drivers' Championship after this race. Now, I still think Abu Dhabi 2022 was a better race than 21. It was just missing some of that tension, and honestly, Abu Dhabi's not a great circuit for a season finale. Take it back to Brazil. That's what we want to see. Now, I'm going to make a couple more videos throughout the season, so if you're new to the channel, do be sure to subscribe. There's going to be a lot more cool stuff. I've also left a couple of videos here from earlier in the season. Be sure to check them out, and I'll see you guys soon.